Alice. I'm just going to do a little introduction on behalf of Christ Climate Justice, but on behalf of Christ Climate Justice, the JCR, the MCR, the Davidson Nicol Society and the Darwin Society. We'd really like to welcome you to our event, Divestment. It's a conversation with Christ alumni on the economic, historical and moral perspectives of divestment. I'm going to briefly introduce divestment, the situation in Cambridge and at Christ in particular, and then go into some detail about Christ investments, just so we're all on the same page. I'm sure you're already aware, but divestment is simply the removal of investments in certain sectors to help delegitimise certain industries with the hope to remove their social licence to operate. It's been tried before, for example, in the apartheid in South Africa, tobacco, and the biggest sort of divestment movement at the moment is for fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel divestment campaign is a worldwide campaign. Over 1,000 institutions worldwide have committed to some form of divestment, totaling approximately $13.96 trillion. A diverse set of institutions have been involved, from the country of Ireland, the city of New York, and in the UK, one of the biggest divestment campaigns in universities. Over half of UK universities have committed to some form of divestment, committing over £12 billion. The divestment campaign is one of the responses to the growing climate crisis. In the IPCC report 2018, it stated that far-reaching and multi-level and cross-sectoral climate mitigation is needed if we are to keep below 1.5 degrees of warming. In 2017, it was reported that just 100 companies worldwide are responsible for 71% of total greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And the divestment campaign links these facts to attack businesses that are driving us further into climate breakdown. Divestment is having a material effect on these companies. The 2018 Shell annual report stated that divestment campaigns are having have the potential to have a material adverse effect on the industry. The divestment campaign in Cambridge has been going since 2015, headed by student group Zero Carbon. The University Central Endowment Fund of £6.4 billion has 5% invested in the energy sector, with estimates that around 4.9% of this total is in coal, gas and oil. The democratic body of the university, Regent's House, has signed graces in support of divestment, and this year a report will be published looking into the advantages and disadvantages of the university's divestment. The campaign has also expanded out to colleges, with Queen's, Clare Hall, Jesus, Selwyn, Downing and Emmanuel all committing to some form of divestment. The campaign at Christ was kind of born out of the university campaign, and it's been going since November 2017, when the JCR passed a motion in support of the college's divestment. 180 students signed a petition in support of divestment in Michaelmas, and the JCR published a detailed report for the council. MCR also supported with the campaign, and this event has been organised in light of the council's decision to reconsider divestment in Easter this year. So just a little bit about Christ's investments. The total endowment is around £126 million, with £95 million of that invested. Just over 10 million of this is directly invested, the rest is held in funds. At the moment, Christ has direct investments in Schlumberger of just over nearly £200,000. This is a notable extractive research and facilitation company whose research involves exploration of oil reserves, which activists insist must remain in the ground to avoid complete climate breakdown. We also have investments in mining company Franco-Nevada, who are also involved in oil, and we have had direct investments in BP until very recently. There is also £400,000 directed in arms, invested in arms companies. And as well as direct investments, Christ has a large number of indirect investments through funds which have significant exposure to fossil fuels. As many of these funds do not publish the details of the fossil fuel exposure, we've only been able to work out that at least £2 million is associated with fossil fuel companies, but in reality this number is probably a lot bigger. That's just kind of a really brief introduction from me. We're going to hear loads more from our amazing speakers. The sort of structure of the event is going to have some introductions, then speeches of around 15 minutes each, and then we'll go into questions from the chair and then questions from the audience, and we really hope that we can kind of promote a really lively debate around this issue. So I'd like to welcome Alyssa Gilbert, who's our chair. She read Natural Sciences at Cambridge at Christ's, matriculating in 1996. She's currently the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute, Climate Change and Environment at Imperial College London. So, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the students for inviting us all to be here. I think we probably all agree it's impressive that you can put together such an event in the middle of your undergraduate studies, and it's always nice to be invited back to college to get involved in things that we care about and work on. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn as they talk. Save up your questions. I'll throw a few questions in just to get the discussion going. Yeah, but don't feel restricted by that. There'll be a chance for you to speak. So first up is Tim Jackson, who's currently director of the Centre for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey, and a professor of sustainable development there. He just told me that he read maths at Christ's, but now has got funding from both the social and physical sciences. So what you're doing now doesn't restrict what you can do in the future. He also, used to do things like representing the college in cross-country running and rowing. So lots of activity. So without further ado, Tim is going to introduce his perspective on divestment.
Thank you, Alyssa. Eva asked me to talk mainly about the economics of divestment and of sustainable investment. And I suppose I should stay in that economics box as much as possible, and I will come back to the hard numbers around it. But one of the points I want to make to you really is that it's very difficult to separate out ethics and long-run economics. It's easier to separate out short-run economics because everybody knows that you can make a lot of money, or a few people can make a lot of money by investing in bad things and getting out at the right time. And in fact, that was a culture that so much embodied our ideas of investment that this idea, the idea of investment as a commitment to the future, almost went completely missing at certain points in our history. And in particular, before the financial crisis, of course, when investment basically became a form of gambling casino. This is a graph of the net lending by sector to each sector. It's Bank of England data, and what it shows you is a kind of really weird story of how our investment and financial architecture grew from being something that was sort of balanced between real investments in firms, a little bit of investment for people in mortgages, in housing, lending to house building, and then this smaller section, which is financial companies lending to financial companies. And over that period of time, 1988 till financial crisis, that grew massively until actually the lending of investment to financial companies by financial companies began to structure what investment was doing. All kinds of really strange instruments where you could hedge against the value of shares in companies, where you could trade companies into collateralized debt obligations when those were hedged against by your rating agencies. And what the result of that was, obviously, and we all know that now, was exactly the financial crisis. Lots of people did make money over the short term. Over the long term, it was disastrous. It was not about commitment. It was actually a kind of winner takes all or loses all game in which the rich could do very well and ordinary people suffered enormously. That's not the kind of investment that is either ethical or, I would argue, in the long run, prudential in an economic sense to hold. And we're now in the process of building a different kind of bubble, which is fossil fuel investments, at a point when most of the fossil fuel resources that exist under the ground will have to be kept under the ground if we want to reach a 1.5 target. So here at the bottom, this black line across there, that is below that line is the only thing that we can afford to burn if we are to remain 50% chance of achieving 1.5 degree target. So the rest of it, actually, this unburnable carbon, as it's called, Carbon Track has done a fantastic amount of work looking at all this unburnable carbon, actually is what we cannot afford to burn, and only this very small part at the bottom, to get a 50% chance, we can just about burn. Now, 50% chance is actually not that good when you think and you look at the difference between a 1.5 degree target and a 2 degree target, for example. It's about you lose all of your coral reefs at 2 degrees and you retain some of them at 1.5 degrees. You lose acres of low-lying wetlands at 2 degrees and you can gain a fraction of that back at 1.5 degrees. So the science now agrees that 1.5 is a decent target to aim for. 50% chance of addressing it is not that good, I would say. So if we went for something a little bit better and argued, let's say, look for a 66% chance of staying within 1.5 degrees, actually the carbon that we can afford to burn is only that. And that's our carbon budget between now and the end of this century. At the moment, the world is burning carbon at around about 40 billion tonnes of carbon a year. The budget is 420 billion tonnes of carbon. It's not a difficult mathematics to realise that actually in 10 years' time, that's it. The carbon budget is blown. What does that mean for a country like the UK? This is really where the numbers get very interesting, because you have to make judgments about the fairness of our carbon budget within the UK. And if you take a few things into account, such as our historical responsibility for carbon and the need of the developing world to burn some carbon to develop themselves, you actually find a carbon budget, a fair carbon budget for the UK, is only about 2.5 billion tonnes per year. And we're burning that on a consumption basis at around about 600 million tonnes per year. So in other words, in 5 years' time, the UK's carbon budget is exhausted. That's the scale of the divestment that's needed from fossil fuel resources. And if you look at what that means in terms of a transition to net zero carbon, that's our trend there. The red line says you're overdrawn. By the time you get to the red line, you've blown that 2.5 billion tonnes budget. Even if we aim for 2050, which is the government's current target, and this is a really interesting point, if you do that in a linear fashion down to 2050, you've still blown your carbon budget within the space of 5 years or so. And this is one of the reasons why I did this work, was because actually I was talking quite a lot with Extinction Rebellion as a target of 2025, which they more or less plucked out of the air. But actually, if you draw a straight line, a linear reduction that stays within your carbon budget, that is about where you get to. That's the latest linear pathway. If you were decreasing in a linear pathway, that's when we need to get to zero, net zero carbon by. And the only way you can get out of that trap, so to speak, is to do some faster reduction in the beginning, and then your reduction at the end can be slower. So you can eke this target out to 2050, but only if you have really fast levels of reduction very, very soon. So, and this is one of the points, I think, about divest, invest, is that a lot of the arguments around 2050 still seem quite a long way away. So we're talking still about 30 years away. And so obviously, you know, the policy urgency associated with a 2050 target is virtually negligible. But the reality of a carbon budget says that 2050 is meaningless if you've already blown that budget before. 10 years max is the timescale over which these transitions have to take place. How is that actually going to occur? Well, obviously it requires very rapid structural change. So you're replacing not just the odd power station, but entire infrastructures to get them to be net zero carbon. You're making massive shifts in investment, directed or incentivized investment that's a scale completely atypical of mature post-industrial economies. It's outside the experience of the existing financial institutions and the way they're managing things. And you rely actually on fairly disruptive changes, which we can call in a meaningful way post-normal behaviours. They are not what we're used to looking at. Investors must behave differently, savers will behave differently, consumers, producers, shareholders, investment managers will all be behaving very differently. And that creates a series of risks both to investors and fund managers. And it's a series of risks that will only rise. This is Mark Carney from June 2019. He's been an absolutely exceptional governor of the Bank of England, and his leadership has created an awareness in financial institutions of what's coming down the line that was just unprecedented, really. And his argument, of course, is the longer you wait, the harder that gets. That's the lesson from the net zero curves. You can't possibly make that transition too late, because you're then facing not only the transition risks, you're facing all the risks associated with a warming world. So you're kind of hit from both sides, if you like. You're hit with uncertainty around your financial architecture and your investment portfolios on the one side, and if you don't make those changes, you're hit with the impacts of climate change that will require ever greater investments to increase our resilience against climate risk. And that's the territory in which we have to look at what's happening to financial assets. So the term, and it's quite a useful term in ways, that's been generated by Carbon Tracker amongst others, is this term stranded assets. If you have to make that transition that fast, and if you are successful in making that transition that fast, your fossil fuel investments are just wasted investment. They are sitting there. If they're generating carbon, they're creating climate risks. If they're not generating carbon, they're creating investment risks. They are sitting in your portfolio as basically stranded assets. And so the speed at which we have to get out of those stranded assets and the difficulties of identifying where they sit, if we're ordinary investors, and I'll come on to the sense of being an ordinary investor myself a little bit later on, is a sense of not knowing what to do. And the architecture of making those decisions is an incredibly complex one, but it is one that as investors of any kind, in pensions, in savings, in endowments, we have to take seriously, because we're sitting on something like $1.6 trillion of potentially stranded assets by 2025. That's the rate at which those assets could become useless. And that's actually a fairly conservative assessment, because that's done, I believe, on a 2-degree target, so a 1.5-degree target would actually increase that number substantially. All of those assets being wasted. What's the impact of that? Here's an interesting graphic. So this is an estimate of the exposure of stranded assets, of assets to changes that would have to take place in the transition to a sustainable economy in the FTSE 100. And you can see there that around about 40% of the FTSE 100 is exposed to sectors which are either directly carbon burning or carbon reliant, power generation, mining, energy intensive sectors. And although that might seem kind of, well, that's 40% of the FTSE 100, the other 60% is okay, we don't have that much interest in shares anyway. The knock-on effect of 40% of the FTSE 100 going down under a situation of stranded assets is potentially catastrophic in terms of the economy. And this is a point, I think, where ethics and economics come together. So yes, you may be able to sit for a while with fossil fuel assets and make some money from them. But you're doing that in a situation where you know you have to have that transition, you know the transition has to be fast, you know by 2025 you have to be basically out of fossil fuel assets, and the only thing you're doing by delaying moving that investment essentially is either creating a bigger, riskier transition, or else committing yourself to a climate change that will have knock-on impacts across society and indeed across the world. So there's a kind of ethical thing there, and there's also an economic thing there, and I'm going to come on to the hard-nosed economics. I just want to make a little aside here, which is one of the reasons why investors still think it might be a good idea to invest in fossil fuels, is because governments are busy trying to persuade them to by subsidising fossil fuels. So the unsubsidised prices of fossil fuels actually would already take us out of some fossil fuels. But governments are still subsidising, in spite of having net zero carbon targets, are still subsidising those investments, and indeed still directing foreign lending into fossil fuel investments in other countries where we know we shouldn't be doing it. That's a policy blindness, you could call that, to the demands of the situation, but it's also extremely dangerous because it's subsidising unsustainable investments. Is it ethical for a college that is dedicated to the welfare of its future generations to be investing in things which are maybe profitable in the short term but are definitely wrong in the long term? Clearly not. There's another question though, and this is where I appeal more to mammon than to ethics, if you like. I think, Alice, you mentioned the impact on fossil fuel share prices. So this is a really interesting story. This is Exxon's share price from 2015 to 2020, which has been declining quite steadily over the last few years. And the article, which was an Investment Weekly article discussing this, said normally a share price this low would be a buy price. This is the price at which you go out and buy shares in Exxon because the price is so low. And the article was all about how this is not a buy price. This is not a price at which you go out and buy into Exxon, either for ethical reasons or for economic prudential reasons, because it's going to go down again, because it basically has to, unless Exxon decides it's going to invest in something other than fossil fuels. Now, some companies are doing that. BP, for example, has a big campaign, an advertising campaign, trying to persuade you that BP is actually mostly investing in renewables. The reality is, and this is a very important campaign that belongs to client Earth, the reality is that you are being misled. Those companies, which are mainly fossil fuel companies and have always been mainly fossil fuel companies, have occasionally had some renewable investment and are moving some of their portfolios, but they are still 90% fossil fuel companies. And so you're being persuaded, if you like, that you can invest in a company like this or continue to invest in a company like this, and they're heading in the right direction. Have a look at Client Earth's campaign, sign their petition. There is not enough honesty. The whole truth in fossil fuel advertising doesn't exist. So come back to this idea of investment as a commitment. What portfolio of things would we want to invest in? Clearly, for the climate transition, we want to be investing in green technologies, renewable energy, energy efficiency, resource productivity. Most of the time, these investments are no-brainers for some reasons that I'll show you later. The price of renewables is coming down very fast. Energy efficiency is always a good bet because it saves you money, resource productivity likewise. We need also, of course, to be investing in infrastructure, and we shouldn't think only in terms of climate, we need to be investing in ecological protection. The message is coming out of the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on biosystems and ecosystem diversity. I can't remember what it's not, it doesn't flow off the tongue, I'm afraid. But their report last year came out basically saying that we are losing species faster than at any time in the last 1,000 years. An extraordinary, an abdication of responsibility. And at the same time, there are enormous economic dimensions of that, because we're basically undermining our food chains, undermining our habitats, undermining our own conditions of life. And so in any sense, either ethical or prudential, actually investing in ecosystem protection matters. And then, of course, if we were to invest in a different kind of economy, these are also places where you could argue these could be nice, ethical, sustainable investments. As an investment in an economy that works for everyone, where you're delivering the services of health and education, where you're looking after people, where you're providing meaningful employment. That is what I mean when I talk about investment as a commitment. Here is the strangest part, in a way, of my presentation. So you would think, yeah, that's all lovely, that's all fluffy, that's rose-tinted futures, that's green activists talking about doing the right thing. This is fund performance. So this is a fund, there are many funds that are doing this now. This is a fund that's run actually by one of my ex-PhD students, and it's a Sustainable Futures Fund. It was a major part of Aviva's offering for ethical funds to its savers and investors. And this is the performance of that fund over the last few years. So the upper green line is the Lion Trust Sustainable Future Managed Fund, and the lower line is a kind of middle-ranging benchmark, outperforming the benchmark. I've worked with Peter Michaelis, the fund manager there, for a number of years, looking at how to measure the performance and how to also tailor the investments to the right things. And it comes at me over and over again that these fund performances are at least as good as conventional benchmarks. This is not a question of rose-tinted, ethical, moral high grounding. It is fundamental economic good sense. What's underpinning that, one of the things that's underpinning that actually is this, which is a real technological economic decline in the costs of things like renewables. So this was solar photovoltaics even just 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, and wind energy, the green one, over 10 years ago. So those are our solar technologies above the cost of fossil fuels. Over the space of the last 10 years, they have come down enormously, and now, in an unsubsidized form, sit well below fossil fuel. They are a better investment, a better place to be. And let's bring this right home to the academics in the room. So my pension for many, many years has been in the USS, the University Superannuation Scheme. I've had no control of it whatsoever. I've known, and the students have been very good at telling me, that actually those funds are investing in fossil fuel. Recently, and it's a bit of the pension shake-up, we are now allowed as academics to go onto the USS website and choose where to put our pensions. So as soon as I had that capability, I went online, and yes, believe it or not, there is an ethical equities fund that I, as a professor at the university, can invest in. So I thought, I made the decision I'm going to invest in that, and I thought maybe I'll just look at the fund performance. Which of those funds is the ethical fund? One is a growth fund, one is a UK equities fund, and one is an ethical equities fund. You probably can guess the punchline. The punchline is the red one in our own pensions has performing better than not just benchmarks for growth funds and UK equity funds for several years. We are, if you like, in a situation of being persuaded to do exactly the wrong kind of investment for very short-term reasons, without enough control or say-so over even our own pensions. And that's a, to me, that's a tragic situation, but it is a situation that's changing. It's a situation that can change. It's a situation that requires activism to change. It requires people to be involved, as you, as students, have been involved. And if you have a pension, if you have power, then you can work out where to spend that on a peaceful, prosperous, safe world, and make sure that the people who run your funds are running funds which are ethical, which are sustainable, which are performing as well as they can do, and which are guaranteeing investment as a commitment to the future. That's what investment should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Fantastic start. Now call up Fiona. Fiona Harvey is an environmental journalist. You've probably read some of the things she's written in The Guardian, and prior to that, the Financial Times. It also appears to be that you've interviewed anyone would ever have wanted to interview, from Sir David Attenborough to Ban Ki-moon and Sir Tim Berners-Lee. But we look forward to hearing what you have to say about divestment. Fiona.
Lovely. Thank you. Should I stand up? Is that easier? Right. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Yes, I'm the environment correspondent at The Guardian, and I've been an environmental journalist since 2004. Before that I wrote about a thing called the internet. And yes, I was trying to remember actually what we did when I was here at Christ, and I matriculated in 1990 to do with the environment. I think that the greatest achievement at Christ at that time was when we managed to get the people who ran the buttery to start recycling all the empty bottles and selling them to landfill, which was a triumph at the time. Luckily, more exciting things were happening in other parts of the world, because of course at that time we also got, that was the beginning of our real international understanding of climate change, because we had in 1988 we had the first moves to set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who's we got their first report in 88, and that was the beginning of our really knowledge on climate change. And of course in 1992 we got the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Rio Environment Summit, and that was incredibly important. And of course since then, since the UNFCCC was signed, we've made such enormous progress that our emissions are still growing. Despite 30 years of international climate change talks that culminated 5 years ago in the Paris Agreement, which is the first time that all developed and developing countries got together and decided that we would limit warming to no more than 2 degrees, with an aspiration to stay below 1.5 degrees. Since then, emissions have risen by 4%. So we're really not doing terribly well so far. The divestment campaign has shown a bit more success than the world has in meeting its Paris goals. And for both the divestment campaign and the Paris goals, this is a crucial year. 2020 is a crucial year, we are coming up to a crunch UN meeting. It will be the most important meeting since Paris, under the UNFCCC, which will take place in Glasgow, or probably in Glasgow. There's been some kerfuffle around, but it will be in Glasgow. That will be in Glasgow this November, hosted by the UK, COP26. And what we can hope for at COP26 is that we do actually use that opportunity to make progress, that we encourage all countries to come forward with targets, national targets on greenhouse gas emissions that are actually commensurate with the challenge, and that would actually help us to meet the Paris goals, because at the moment we would be at 3 degrees of warming or beyond, based on the commitments that countries have made at the moment. So there's everything to play for this year. And having been to the last 15 COPs, the UN annual climate change meetings, I can tell you that really nothing will happen unless there is pressure from civil society and pressure from businesses, putting pressure on governments to make the changes that are needed. Because what happens at these international meetings is that governments retreat behind closed doors, they do deals in secret, they argue literally over the placement of a comma or a semicolon for days, and they argue about arcane things like the carbon credits that you should be able to trade under the Kyoto Protocol, which is from 1997. We're still arguing about carbon credits under the Kyoto Protocol. We still argued about that last year at the climate change talks. It's absurd what goes on inside the climate change talks. It bears no relation to the actual reality of the threat that we've just seen presented to us. And the only way that you can get the climate talks to align with reality is if you get that pressure from civil society. So that's why it's so particularly important that we're having this discussion at the moment, this year, because this year the focus is on the UK, and it will be on bringing that pressure to bear. And this is one way in which we can all bring pressure to bear through our finances. Just to take you back a little bit on why this is important, I write for the Guardian now. I used to write for the Financial Times, and so there's an interesting piece of financial history that used to be a sort of footnote in MBA textbooks, which has assumed a much greater importance. It's a case from 100 years ago, 1919, Dodge versus the Ford Motor Company. It's an interesting one, so you should look it up. But essentially, what the case hinged on was what the purpose of a company is, the purpose of a corporation. Because before that, a company could be seen as having an awful lot of different duties to an awful lot of different sections of society, what we would call stakeholders these days. So obviously there were its owners, there were its employees, there were its customers, but there was also wider society and indeed the country of which it was a part, and the economy. So a company was seen to have duties to all these different stakeholders. What came to the fore in the case I mentioned, the Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, was a legal ruling that essentially restricted companies in what they could care about. So that instead of seeing themselves in the round as having duties to all these different parts of society, instead they were told that their real duty, their only duty, was to shareholders. And that their duty to shareholders was to maximise the value of the shareholding to the shareholder. And that became the central tenet of how companies were managed and how their finances were managed, that they really owed this duty only to shareholders. And that's why divestment is important, because when companies are only beholden to shareholders, then the only way to bring pressure on them is through that shareholding. You can't argue, or it becomes more difficult to argue in a legal sense, that they should have a broader responsibility to the rest of society. But you can argue that their shareholders, that they're not delivering value to their shareholders through their actions, and shareholders can bring companies to account. So that's kind of the basis, the kind of legal basis on which a lot of the divestment campaign is predicated. We've always had activist investors of one kind or another, but for a long time activist investors were investors who essentially wanted to cause trouble in companies to make more money for themselves, really. There were activist investors who went in and tried to break up companies because they thought that they could be their value of selling off the parts was worth more to them than having the company as a whole. There were sort of asset strippers. That was the kind of activist investor that we had in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's really only in the last decade that we've seen activist investors with ethical aims. And the divestment campaign, as I've seen it as an environmental journalist, really only started to take hold in the 2010s, in the early 2010s. And it was after, because again, this is all very much tied to the UN talks and the trajectory of the UN talks, because in 2009 we had the talks in Copenhagen, which came up with a sort of partial agreement that countries should get together and try and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But it was very problematic, the talks didn't go very well, the agreement itself was not a fully legally binding treaty, so it wasn't very clear that countries would obey it. And so a lot of people in the climate change movement were looking for other ways outside the kind of the governmental route to bring pressure to bear that would bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And they lit on shareholder activism and divestment as a means of doing that. And then we had, again, this kind of comes to a head again with another landmark UN set of UN climate change talks, the Paris Agreement of 2015. In the run-up to the Paris Agreement, we saw a great acceleration of this divestment movement. Suddenly we saw pension funds taking a lot of interest, particularly in the United States. We saw an awful lot of universities start to take notice. I remember we did a kind of survey, but it was immensely laborious. It's one of those bits of journalism that for which I really wish that ethically we could have an unpaid intern. It consists of me phoning 100 odd universities around the country and asking them if they had a divestment policy. And the answer for most of them was no. And that was in 2015. If you did that again, I think you'd find some very, very different conclusions now, which is a good thing. But the reason this all came to a head in 2015 is because we had all of this pressure coming to bear on the Paris Agreement. And so the Guardian played a role in that. We had the Keep It in the Ground campaign, as we've heard mentioned. And we had, it was Bill McKibben, who's a very well-known American environmentalist, who was one of the leaders behind that. And it was aimed at persuading people that of this truth, that basically cannot burn much more in the way of fossil fuels, that we are going to have to accept this economic hit of leaving fossil fuels in the ground, and that has implications for investors across the board, not just investors in fossil fuels, for whom it leaves the stranded assets that we've just been hearing about, but also investors in all forms across the economy, in all forms of business. So, following the Keep It in the Ground campaign and the divestment that resulted from that, I think we got over 1,000 institutions that changed their investment portfolio and started divesting from fossil fuels. So that was a huge achievement, really. And I think we got to something like, it was over 12 trillion, I think, in assets that came out